At 2,814 meters above sea level, Mount Hermon sits locked inside a tri-border military zone where Israeli, Syrian, and Lebanese jurisdiction lines converge. Civilian access to the upper summit has been restricted for decades. The mountain is real, the coordinates are checkable, and a text dating to at least the 3rd century before the Common Era names this exact peak as the precise location where 200 celestial beings descended, gathered, and swore an oath together before the world changed. Removed, reclassified, called apocryphal. 3 deliberate steps taken across 3 separate centuries to move one document out of the canon and out of reach. It did not disappear completely. In 1947, excavators working the caves at Qumran pulled Aramaic fragments from the dust. Fragment 4Q201 dated to the 3rd century before the Common Era, older than any New Testament manuscript by several hundred years. The text had been there the entire time. Ethiopia never discarded it at all. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the complete Book of Enoch when the Western Church let it go. And that complete text is what translators have worked from ever since. Here is what the text actually says. Enoch recorded lust not as a private failing, not as a human weakness requiring pastoral care. He recorded it as cosmic rebellion, a legal charge, the formal cause of a catastrophe that reshaped the earth. In the next several minutes, you will see the exact oath sworn on that mountain, the desire that drove it, and the corruption it released into the world's bloodline. If forbidden biblical history surfaces here every week, and it does, subscribing takes 3 seconds. The oldest surviving manuscript evidence for what happened on that mountain sits inside fragment 4Q201, recovered from Qumran Cave 4, currently held by the Israel Antiquities Authority. R.H. Charles produced the standard English translation in 1912, working from the complete Ge'ez text preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. His translation has been cross-referenced, challenged, and ultimately confirmed by every major scholar who followed him, including Dr. Michael Knibb, whose 1978 Oxford edition remains the critical academic reference. The passage in question comes from the 6th chapter of 1st Enoch, verses 1 through 6. It opens with a declaration of desire. The sons of God, the text says, looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful. But the Ge'ez verb used here is not a passive observation. The root is hasasa. It means to covet flesh, not to admire, not to notice, to covet. The same legal register used in covenant law to describe a violation of binding agreement. Enoch is not recording attraction. He is recording a charge. 200 of them gathered. That number is specific, and it is repeated. Not a few, not many. 200, named and organized into groups of 10. Each group assigned a leader. Shemihaza is named as the chief. He speaks first, and what he says is a legal problem. He tells the others that he alone will bear the guilt if they proceed. The others refuse to let one bear what all intend to do. So they swear an oath together, all 200, on the summit of Mount Hermon, bound by mutual curse. If any one of them withdraws, the curse falls on him alone. If all proceed, the guilt is shared, and the oath holds them forward. Here is what makes this impossible to explain away. Sworn mutual curse treaties, structured exactly this way, shared liability, named parties, binding oath with penalty clauses, are documented in ancient Near Eastern covenant law. The Hittite suzerainty treaties of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era follow the same structure. The Mari texts, discovered in modern Syria and dated to around 1800 BCE, record oath rituals that carry the same irreversible legal weight. Scholars of ancient treaty law, including Dr. Klaus Baltzer in his 1971 work on the Covenant Formulary, have mapped this structure in detail. Enoch's account does not use loose spiritual language. It uses the precise vocabulary of binding legal covenant. A pre-literate oral tradition does not accidentally generate that level of juridical precision. The text is recording something its author understood as a formal legal event. 200 parties, named leadership, mutual liability clause, binding oath with curse attached. That is not mythology. That is a treaty document. The location matters too. Mount Hermon was not chosen arbitrarily. In ancient Semitic cosmology, high places were understood as the boundary between the ordered human world below and the realm of divine jurisdiction above. An oath sworn on a high place was sworn at the threshold. It was sworn where both parties, the divine and the human, could be held accountable. Choosing Hermon as the site of descent and oath was itself a legal act. It placed the covenant at the one geographic point where its terms could not be disputed. The mountain still stands at 2,814 meters. The military restrictions still hold. And the text that names it has survived every attempt to reclassify it out of existence.
Before we continue, I want to show you something that could completely change how you see the Book of Enoch and what was buried inside it. Most people spend years collecting fragments of knowledge without ever finding the complete picture. That's exactly why we built the complete library. It brings together the Watcher's descent and their forbidden transmissions, the angelic hierarchy and its role in the end time sequence, the soul's journey through death into the intermediate state, and the precise prophetic timeline running all the way to the final judgment into one practical system. If you've enjoyed the teachings we've explored on this channel, you're going to love what's inside. You can find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a second to do that.
But the oath is only the beginning of what Enoch recorded. What the 200 did after they swore it is where the document becomes something the early church could not afford to leave in circulation. The Book of the Watchers preserves what happened next. 1 Enoch, verses 1 and 2 of the 7th passage, recorded in the Ethiopic manuscript tradition, translated by R.H. Charles in his 1912 Oxford Critical Edition. Charles spent decades with these texts. His translation remains the benchmark against which every subsequent rendering is measured. The text is explicit. The Watchers took wives from among the daughters of men. They went into them. They defiled themselves. That last phrase carries more weight than the English renders. The Ge'ez original uses the verb tafashahu, not a passive construction, not an accidental contamination. Tafashahu is active, reflexive, and irreversible. It describes a deliberate crossing of a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. The pollution is permanent by definition. The text is not describing a sin that could be confessed and undone. It is describing a category violation. Beings of one order entering a biological covenant that was never designed for them. That distinction matters enormously. Heavenly beings crossing a biological boundary. That concept, written in a mountain monastery in Ethiopia, preserved in a language most scholars in the first century could not read, describes something that has no business appearing in an ancient document. The mechanics of biological reproduction, the idea that two radically different orders of being could produce viable offspring, the implicit understanding that genetic material carries identity. These are concepts that belong to a laboratory, not a hillside scribal tradition. He had no framework for this, yet the text describes it with structural precision. And then the offspring are named, the Nephilim. The text gives their stature, 300 cubits. That is not a vague mythological number. 300 cubits converts to precisely 137 meters. That is taller than the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, taller than most modern skyscrapers. A biological entity of that scale would require skeletal density, cardiovascular pressure, and oxygen delivery systems that no known terrestrial biology can sustain. The text is describing something that violates the engineering limits of organic life as we understand it. And yet, the description is specific. Not enormous, not giant. 300 cubits. A measurement. The Century Bridge lands here with unusual force. Hybrid biology is now a recognized field of scientific inquiry. The crossing of genetic boundaries between species, the production of chimeric organisms, the mapping of what happens when biological categories are merged. These are not speculative concepts. They are active research programs. The journal Nature published work in 2021 documenting the successful integration of human neural cells into non-human primate embryos, raising immediate ethical questions about biological boundary violations that the scientific community is still working to answer. The ancients called it defilement. We call it transgenic biology. The mechanism they described, two incompatible orders producing hybrid offspring with anomalous physical characteristics, is the same mechanism modern genomics is now carefully mapping and debating. Same phenomenon, different century, different vocabulary, identical structural problem. And this is where it gets disturbing, because the corruption Enoch recorded did not stay biological. The Watchers brought something else with them, something more transferable than their physical nature, something that spread through an entire civilization within a single generation. The 8th passage of 1 Enoch, verses 1 through 3, preserved in the Ethiopic manuscript designated EMML 2080, held at the Ethiopian Microfilm Manuscript Library Collection. This is one of the most complete surviving copies of the Book of the Watchers. The passage is short. It is also one of the most structurally revealing texts in the entire document. It names Azazel. Azazel taught men to make swords, shields, breastplates. He taught the women the art of cosmetics, the coloring of the eyes, the adorning of the body. He taught the making of bracelets, ornaments, and precious stones. And beyond the physical crafts, the text names sorcery, the interpretation of signs, the knowledge of roots and plants and their hidden properties. The Ge'ez term the manuscript uses for what Azazel transmitted is hekmet. In its ordinary usage, hekmet simply means wisdom, but the context strips it of any neutral meaning. This is not wisdom freely given. This is not knowledge that belongs to the human sphere. The text frames it as craft that was withheld by design, information that existed in a higher order of knowledge and was brought down without authorization. Azazel had no mandate to teach. That is the precise charge the text levels. Not that the knowledge was wrong in itself, not that swords are evil or cosmetics are sinful. The charge is structural. The knowledge was transmitted outside the order in which it was meant to exist. The teacher had no authority to teach. The recipients had no context to bear it. And it spread. Within one generation, the text records, the earth was filled with the effects of what Azazel released. Violence increased. Desire became weaponized. The knowledge of metalwork meant the knowledge of weapons. The knowledge of cosmetics meant the knowledge of seduction as a tool of manipulation. Forbidden craft does not stay in the hands of the person who receives it. It propagates. The impossible knowledge beat here is subtle but significant. The idea that unrestricted information transfer causes social breakdown, that knowledge without ethical scaffolding accelerates destruction rather than progress, is a conclusion that took modern sociology generations of data to reach. UNESCO published findings in 2023 documenting the relationship between unrestricted information access and measurable increases in social fragmentation, radicalization, and interpersonal violence. The report spans data from 47 countries. The conclusion is careful but clear. Information without context, transmitted without the relational structures that give it meaning, produces harm at scale. Enoch recorded that conclusion without the data, without the 47 countries, without the longitudinal studies. He recorded it as a direct observation of what one unauthorized teacher produced in one generation. The ancients called it forbidden craft. We call it information asymmetry and radicalization pathways. The mechanism is identical. Knowledge weaponizes desire when it arrives without the framework designed to contain it. Azazel did not teach people to want more than they should. He gave them the tools to act on what they already wanted, and removed the natural limits that had kept those wants from becoming catastrophic. Same mechanism, different century. The data now confirms what the text named first, but here is what makes this stranger. Enoch does not simply record the sin and leave it there. He records the response, a precise, structured, divine judgment delivered in terms so specific that scholars have spent decades working out its timeline. And the timeline lands somewhere that should not be possible for a text this old. The 10th passage of 1 Enoch, verses 4 through 6. This is not only an Ethiopic manuscript claim. Fragment 4Q204, recovered from Qumran Cave 4, currently held by the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem. The fragment predates the Common Era. It is among the oldest physical witnesses to this text that survives, and it preserves the judgment sequence intact. The divine command in that passage uses the Giez verb hayao, bind him. That is not a narrative past tense. It is not a historical account of something that once happened and concluded. Hayao is a present tense command, an imperative still in force at the moment of utterance. The text is not reporting that Azazel was bound. It is recording the command being issued, active, immediate, ongoing. The instruction that follows is architectural. Bind him, cast him into darkness. Lay upon him rough and jagged rocks. Cover him with darkness. Let him abide there forever. The text describes a sealed underground prison, not a metaphor, not a symbolic realm, a specific confinement with physical characteristics. Rough rock, complete darkness, permanent closure. The impossible knowledge beat here is the duration, 70 generations. That is the confinement period the text specifies for the watchers. Not an indefinite punishment, a counted one. 70 generations from the time of Enoch. Scholars have worked this calculation carefully. Dr. George Nicholsberg, whose 2001 Hermonia commentary on 1 Enoch remains the most exhaustive critical analysis of the text in English, places a biblical generation at approximately 40 years for the purposes of this calculation. 70 generations from the period the text associates with Enoch brings the endpoint to somewhere in the range of the 1st century of the Common Era. He had no calendar, no historical vantage point from which to project that number. Yet the endpoint the text calculates lands within one of the most consequential periods in Western religious history. The century bridge here is structural, not metaphorical. The ancients called it binding, a sealed underground confinement with a counted duration. We call it irreversible judgment, the point at which a process becomes permanent and no further appeal is possible. The concept is identical across the distance of millennia. What changes is only the vocabulary used to describe what cannot be undone. And the 4Q204 fragment preserves this in a physical object you can examine today. The Israel Antiquities Authority has it. The ink is still legible on the parchment. The judgment sequence is there, in Aramaic, written before the Common Era, describing a confinement measured in generations that terminates at a moment scholars can calculate with reasonable precision. That is not mythology operating at a comfortable distance. That is a document making a falsifiable claim about duration, and the duration resolves somewhere history remembers clearly. The text does not stop there. It does not simply pronounce judgment and close. It names the sin that triggered all of this, with a precision that explains why the early church could not afford to leave this document in general circulation. Because what Enoch identified as the root cause, is something the centuries that followed would systematically reclassify. Not as sin, as virtue. The Ethiopic manuscripts exist today. The Qumran Aramaic fragments exist today. Fragments cataloged as 4Q201 through 4Q212, held by the Israel Antiquities Authority, open to verified academic request. The classification Enoch applied, cosmic rebellion rooted in lust, is still readable on those pages, still checkable. The centuries that followed called it something else, something noble, even sacred. But the original record was never destroyed, only repositioned. And the mechanism Enoch described, the oath, the descent, the defilement, has no expiration clause written into it. The warning was never canceled. It was reclassified, and the fragments are still saying so. If what these fragments still say matters to you, leave your reading below. And if suppressed scripture still speaks, this channel is here every week.